My 3 children, the ones I had raised, educated, and supported through every crisis, gathered in my living room on the day of my retirement celebration and told me I had become financially and emotionally draining. They suggested I sell my Mediterranean villa and move into an age-appropriate facility while transferring my assets to them for proper management. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a tear. I simply nodded, called my lawyer, and by sunset had removed their names from every account, property, and will I possessed. Without me, their carefully constructed lives began to crumble. As for me, my real life began the moment I chose myself over their expectations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined my retirement party would end like this. After 40 years as professor of economics at Westlake University, I had envisioned a quiet celebration in the garden of my villa overlooking the Costa del Sol, a property I had purchased decades ago when land in the area was still affordable, before it became the exclusive neighborhood it is today. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the terrace as I arranged platters of my signature paella, garnished with saffron and fresh seafood from the morning market. I had risen before dawn to select the prawns and mussels myself, haggling in my imperfect Spanish with Alejandro, who had been selling seafood at the local market for as long as I had lived here. Only the best for your special day, professora. Eleanor, he had insisted, throwing in extra saffron threads with a wink. The table was already set with my grandmother's porcelain, delicate pieces with hand-painted blue flowers that had survived 2 world wars and countless family dinners. I polished each piece by hand, watching the silverware reflect the golden Mediterranean light. 3 bottles of Rioja Gran Reserva, 1998, stood breathing on the sideboard, a vintage I'd purchased when each of my children had secured their first professional positions, saving them for precisely this moment. The air was filled with the gentle scent of jasmine from the garden I had cultivated with my own hands over the years, a living monument to patience and care. The bougainvillea cascaded over the stone walls in vibrant purple waves, framing the view of the sea that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. This garden had been my sanctuary, my therapy, my pride. Each plant had a story, each stone path, a memory. I remember when I first purchased this villa after my husband Thomas passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack. It had been 23 years now, but sometimes the absence still felt fresh. The children, Michael, Rebecca, and David, were still in university then, and everyone questioned whether a widow approaching middle age could maintain such a property alone. "You're being impractical, Eleanor," my sister Catherine had said with that concerned look she'd perfected over the years. "Think about downsizing instead. Perhaps a nice apartment in the city? Something more manageable for someone in your position." My position. As if widowhood had somehow diminished my capabilities. As if losing Thomas meant I should shrink my own existence to match my new status. Instead, I had done the opposite. I took the insurance money, combined it with our modest savings, and purchased this villa when the Spanish property market had just begun to recover. It was the most defiant act of my life until then, a declaration that I would not just survive, but thrive. And thrive, I did. I earned tenure at the university, published 3 well-received books on economic policy, and established myself as an expert consultant to several European financial institutions. The villa, which had seemed like an extravagance, had quadrupled in value as the area transformed into a haven for the wealthy. What had once been a questionable investment was now a significant asset, one that my financial acumen had recognized, long before others. But this place had always represented more than just a wise investment. It embodied everything I'd worked for: security, beauty, and a legacy to pass on. Every summer, the children would return with their families, laughing, as they dove into the pool, asking for their favorite meals, falling asleep in rooms I carefully maintained for their occasional visits. Michael would bring his wife Sophia and their twins, Emma and Ethan, now 12. He had followed in my footsteps and become a professor of mathematics at Cambridge. Always my serious child, he had grown into a serious man who smiled too rarely, but loved deeply in his reserved way. Rebecca, my middle child, was the creative one, a gallery owner in Berlin with a flair for discovering new talent. Her husband Klaus was a kind German architect who designed sustainable buildings, and their daughter Lily was a precocious 9-year-old who loved to help me in the garden. David, my youngest, remained unmarried, a successful investment banker, in London who worked too hard and visited too rarely, always bringing expensive gifts as though compensating for his absence. I loved them all fiercely, though our relationships had changed over the years. As they built their own lives, their visits became shorter, their calls less frequent. Still, I maintained their rooms, remembered their birthdays, sent care packages during difficult times, and offered financial help when needed, always discreetly, always with the understanding that family supports family. I glanced at the clock on the terrace wall, 4:30 in the afternoon. They had promised to arrive early to help set up. "It's a special day, Mom," Michael had assured me on our last video call, his expression uncharacteristically animated. "We have something important to discuss." Rebecca had nodded in agreement. "It's about your future, Mama. We've been talking and we have some ideas." David had remained quiet during that call, his eyes darting away from the camera whenever I looked directly at him, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was hiding something. I straightened the last napkin, adjusted a vase of fresh-cut roses from my garden, and waited as the ice in the champagne bucket slowly melted under the Spanish sun. The sound of waves crashed rhythmically against the cliffs below, a sound that had comforted me for decades, through loneliness and joy alike. Birds called to each other from the pine trees that dotted the property. In the distance, a fishing boat made its way back to harbor. At 65, I felt I was just beginning a new chapter. I had plans. To travel to places Thomas and I had dreamed of visiting, to mentor young economists at the university, to finally write that memoir I'd been outlining for years. Retirement, for me, wasn't an ending, but a transformation, a time when I could finally prioritize my passions without the constraints of teaching schedules and faculty meetings. As I waited for my children to arrive, I felt a curious mixture of anticipation and unease. Something in their voices during our last call had struck me as odd, a tone I couldn't quite identify, but that reminded me of the way they used to speak to each other when plotting a surprise birthday party or hiding a broken vase. I brushed the feeling aside, attributing it to the sentimentality of the occasion. After all, what could they possibly have to discuss that would change the peaceful life I had so carefully constructed? The sound of car tires on gravel announced their arrival. One by one, 3 rental cars pulled into the circular driveway. Michael's sleek German sedan first, followed by Rebecca's eco-friendly hybrid, and finally David's ostentatious sports car. I watched from the terrace as they emerged, all dressed in what I recognized as their professional attire, rather than the casual vacation clothes they typically wore when visiting Spain. Michael adjusted his tie as he helped Sophia from the passenger seat. The twins remained in the car, faces illuminated by the glow of their tablets. Rebecca and Klaus stepped out next, and I noticed immediately that Lily wasn't with them. David arrived alone, sunglasses hiding his eyes even as the afternoon light began to soften. No grandchildren, no casual clothes, no excited hugs or calls of "abuela" echoing across the garden. Something was wrong. I descended the stone steps. To greet them, arms outstretched, smile firmly in place despite the growing knot in my stomach. "Welcome, my dears. I've missed you so much." Their embraces felt perfunctory. Stiff shoulders, quick releases, eyes that didn't quite meet mine. Michael cleared his throat. "Mother, you're looking well." "Thank you, darling. Where are Emma and Ethan?" And Lily?" I asked, looking past them toward the cars. Rebecca shifted her weight from one foot to another. "We left them with Sophia's parents. We thought, well, we felt this should be an adults-only conversation." "I see," I said, though I didn't. "And what about the important matter you mentioned? Shall we discuss it over dinner? The paella will get cold." David finally removed his sunglasses, revealing bloodshot eyes. "Maybe we should talk first, Mom, before dinner." Sophia and Klaus exchanged glances, a silent communication between in-laws who had clearly been briefed on whatever was coming. "Perhaps we could help serve the drinks," Sophia suggested, her German accent more pronounced than usual, a tell that she was uncomfortable. "That would be lovely," I replied, gesturing toward the terrace. "Everything's ready on the sideboard." As we settled into the cushioned seating area overlooking the sea, I noticed how they positioned themselves, my 3 children on the sofa opposite me, their spouses slightly apart, as though creating a united front. My hands remained steady as I accepted a glass of Rioja from Klaus, but my heart thundered in my chest. Michael, always the designated spokesman in difficult family moments, leaned forward. "Mother, we've been talking a lot lately, about you, about this place, about the future." He gestured around at the villa. "You're 65 now, and living alone in this enormous property isn't practical anymore." "Practical?" I repeated, the word hanging in the air between us. I wasn't aware. My living arrangements needed to be practical. I find them rather joyful, actually. Rebecca jumped in, her art dealer's persuasive tone in full effect. "Mama, what Michael means is that we're concerned. This villa requires so much maintenance. The garden, the pool, the cleaning. It's an enormous burden for someone your age to manage alone." "My age?" I sipped my wine slowly, savoring its rich complexity. "I run 3 miles every morning along the beach. I maintain my garden because I enjoy it. I have Maria who comes to clean twice a week, as she has for 20 years. I'm not sure what about my age concerns you." David cleared his throat, finally, joining the conversation. "It's not just the physical demands, Mom. It's the financial aspect. Property taxes here have skyrocketed. Maintenance costs, utilities, gardeners, housekeepers, it all adds up. And now that you're retiring, your income will be significantly reduced." I set my glass down carefully on the stone table. "I'm well aware of my financial situation, David. I taught economics for 40 years, if you recall. My pension is substantial. My investments have performed exceptionally well, and I have no mortgage on this property. Still," Michael continued, as though I hadn't spoken, "we've been researching some excellent retirement communities. There's one near Valencia that offers beautiful apartments with sea views, full medical care on site, and a vibrant community of educated professionals. You'd have companionship, security, and none of the burdens of property ownership." "And what would happen to my home?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. The 3 of them exchanged glances again, that conspiratorial look I recognized from their childhood. Rebecca reached into her handbag and pulled out a glossy brochure, passing it to me. "We've already spoken to a real estate agent. Properties in this area are at a premium right now. If you sold, you could fund your retirement, care indefinitely, and still have substantial assets to what?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than intended. David shifted uncomfortably. "To manage responsibly for the future." "For your futures, you mean?" I said quietly. Michael sighed. "Mother, please don't make this about us. We're thinking of you. The truth is, you've become increasingly forgetful. Last month when we called, you couldn't remember Lily's birthday. You sent her gift 2 weeks late." I felt a flash of indignation. I was finishing my final academic paper for publication. The gift was intentionally sent to arrive on her half-birthday, as we've done since she was 3. She prefers it that way because it means she gets presents when her friends don't. Rebecca had the grace to look embarrassed, but pressed on. what about the time you forgot to pay your property tax? The municipality sent us a notice. They sent you a notice? I asked, genuinely surprised. How would they have your contact information? The silence that followed answered my question more eloquently than words could have. They had been monitoring me, preparing for this moment, gathering what they perceived as evidence of my decline. You've listed yourselves as secondary contacts, without consulting me, I stated rather than asked. Michael at least had the decency to look ashamed. It was a precaution, given your age and isolation here. I looked from one face to another, these adults who had once been the center of my world, who I had raised to be independent, compassionate humans. How had we arrived here? When had I transformed in their eyes from their capable, intelligent mother into a burden to be managed? Sophia finally broke the uncomfortable silence. Eleanor, please understand, everyone wants what's best for you. And truthfully, the children miss having you closer. In Valencia, you'd be just a short flight from all of us. I almost laughed at that. I'm currently a short flight from all of you, yet you visit perhaps twice a year, usually when you need a free Mediterranean vacation. Klaus winced at my words, but I continued. And now that I've retired, I had planned to visit each of you more regularly. I've already booked tickets to Cambridge for next month to see the twins' school play. Michael looked genuinely surprised. You have? Yes, Michael. Contrary to your assessment of my cognitive abilities, I am capable of operating an airline website and remembering my grandchildren's important events. David leaned forward, abandoning pretense. Mom, let's be direct. The economy is uncertain. My investment firm has taken some hits. Michael's university is cutting funding. Rebecca's gallery barely survived the pandemic. We're all facing financial pressures. And my villa is now worth approximately 4 million euros. I finished for him. We're not asking for handouts, Rebecca protested. We're suggesting a more efficient allocation of resources. This place is far too large for one person. If you sold it, moved somewhere sensible, the excess could help secure all our futures, including the grandchildren's education. I stood, up slowly, walked to the edge of the terrace, and gazed out at the Mediterranean. The sun was beginning to set, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. For 23 years, this view had been my comfort, my constant, my reward for persevering when life had taken Thomas too soon. Let me make sure I understand, I said without turning around. You've decided I am financially and emotionally draining. You want me to sell my home, move into an age-appropriate facility, and transfer my assets to you for proper management. Have I summarized your proposal correctly? Mother, you're making it sound cold and calculated, Michael protested. We love you. We're worried about you. I turned back to face them. Are you worried about me, or are you worried about your inheritance? David flinched. That's unfair. Is it? I asked. Because not once in this conversation have any of you asked what I want, what would make me happy, what my plans are for my retirement. You arrived with brochures, real estate assessments, and a unified strategy to divest me of my home and assets. Rebecca stood up, arms crossed defensively. We're trying to help you make rational decisions before it becomes necessary for us to make them for you. Those words, before it becomes necessary for us to make them for you, hung in the air like a threat. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The hurt began to crystallize into something harder, clearer. I see, I said, my voice calm, despite the storm brewing inside. And when exactly did you envision this transfer of authority taking place? When I turned 65? When I retired? Or perhaps you've been waiting for some sign of incapacity? Sophia, who had remained largely silent, stepped forward. Eleanor, please, this isn't going as planned. We wanted to have a family discussion, not to upset you." "I'm not upset, Sophia," I replied, surprised to find it was true. "I'm disappointed, and I'm seeing with perfect clarity for perhaps the first time in years." I turned to my children. "The paella is getting cold, and I've lost my appetite. I think it would be best if you all found accommodations in town tonight. I need time to process your suggestions." Michael stood, his professor's authority failing him for once. "Mother, don't be hasty. At least let's have dinner and discuss this reasonably." "I find there's nothing reasonable to discuss when one party has already decided the outcome," I said. "You can call Ignacio at the Hotel Miramar. Tell him you're my family. He'll find rooms for you even in high season." "You're overreacting," David said, his banker's composure cracking. "We've come all this way to decide my fate without my input," I finished. "Yes, you've made that abundantly clear. And now I'd like some privacy to consider my response. We can reconvene tomorrow for breakfast, 9 o'clock if that suits everyone's schedule." They gathered their things in awkward silence, exchanging glances that ranged from concerned to annoyed. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca approached and placed a hand on my arm. "Mama, we love you," she said, her voice softer now. "We just want what's best." I covered her hand with mine. "I know you believe that, darling, but tomorrow, we're going to have a very different conversation about what best means and who gets to decide." I watched from the terrace as their cars disappeared down the winding driveway, the taillights vanishing around the curve like retreating stars. Only then did I allow myself to sink into a chair, my hands finally betraying a slight tremor as I poured another glass of the wine meant for celebration. In the growing darkness, with the sound of waves crashing below, I began to formulate a plan. That night, I barely slept. The waves that had lulled me to sleep for decades now seemed to crash against the cliffs with an urgent rhythm that matched my racing thoughts. By dawn, I had watched the stars fade and the first golden rays break across the horizon. A sunrise I had seen countless times but now observed with new eyes. I showered, dressed in my favorite linen suit, the color of sage. Thomas always said it brought out the green in my hazel eyes, and applied my makeup with particular care. If this was to be a battle, I would face it with every bit of the dignity I had cultivated over 65 years of life. At precisely 7:30 a.m., I picked up my phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Alejandro Vega, my attorney in Madrid who had handled my affairs since Thomas died. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm with familiarity. "Eleanor, what a pleasure. To what do I owe this early morning call?" "Alejandro, I need your immediate assistance with some significant changes to my estate and financial arrangements," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of what I was asking. "How quickly can you come to the villa?" There was a pause, then his voice turned serious. "Is everything all right, my friend?" "No," I answered honestly, "but it will be. I need to protect myself." "From whom?" he asked, though I suspected he already knew the answer. "My children." His sigh conveyed complete understanding. "I can be there by noon. In the meantime, sign nothing, agree to nothing. Promise me, Eleanor. You have my word." The second call was to Maria Delgado, my housekeeper of 20 years, who had become more friend than employee over the decades. "Senora Eleanor," she answered. "I was not expected until Thursday. Maria, I know it's your day off, but I find myself in need of your help and discretion. My children have arrived with unwelcome suggestions about my future. They're staying in town but returning for breakfast at 9. Would you come?" "I will be there in 30 minutes," she replied without hesitation. "And I will bring my nephew, Carlos. You remember he works at the bank in Malaga? He is very smart with these financial matters." "Thank you, Maria," I said, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "I don't know what I would do without you." "Pfft." She dismissed my sentiment with typical Spanish pragmatism. "We take care of each other. No, as we have always done. The third call was to Victoria Bennett, my oldest friend from university days who had retired to Portugal 5 years earlier. We spoke at least weekly, though I had said nothing yet about my children's unexpected visit. "Ellie?" she answered cheerfully. "You're calling early. Couldn't sleep?" "Vicky, do you remember how we used to say that one day we'd live together like those two old ladies in that house on Maple Street when we were girls? How they traveled together and had adventures well into their 80s? There was a pause. "I remember. We said we'd scandalize our children and spend their inheritance on cruises and gigolo tour guides. I laughed despite everything. How quickly could you come for an extended visit? And by extended, I mean possibly permanent." To her credit, Victoria didn't miss a beat. "Is everything all right?" "No," I said for the second time that morning. "But I have a plan, and I need my oldest ally." "I can be there by tomorrow afternoon," she replied. "Pack champagne and explanation, in that order." "I love you, Vicky," I said softly. "Save the sentiment for when I've actually done something useful. Now, go face whatever dragon needs slaying. I'll bring my sword tomorrow." By the time Maria arrived with her nephew Carlos, a serious young man in his early 30s with kind eyes and a respectful demeanor, I had laid out everything I knew about my children's plans on the dining table: the retirement facility brochure, notes from their conversation, and my own financial documents. Carlos reviewed everything methodically while Maria prepared coffee, muttering in Spanish about ungrateful children and casting concerned glances my way. "Senora Whitmore," Carlos said finally, "your financial position is exemplary. Your pension alone would support you comfortably. The investment portfolio you've maintained has performed exceptionally well, and this property," he gestured around at the villa, "has appreciated beyond anyone's projections when you purchased it. You are, forgive my bluntness, quite wealthy." "Wealthy enough to support 3 adult children who have made questionable financial decisions?" I asked. He considered this. "That depends on the extent of their needs and the duration of support. But more importantly, it depends on whether you wish to do so." "I don't," I said, surprising myself with the immediacy of my response. "I've supported them through university, helped with down payments on homes, contributed to the grandchildren's education funds. I've done my part. I can't be their safety net forever." Carlos nodded. "Then we should discuss how to protect your assets immediately. I can make some recommendations, but your attorney will need to implement them properly." For the next hour, Carlos outlined options for restructuring my finances. By the time we heard car tires on the gravel driveway, I had a clear path forward. "Maria," I said as my housekeeper arranged fresh-cut fruit on the breakfast table, "would you and Carlos stay? I'd like witnesses to this conversation." She nodded firmly. "We will be in the kitchen, close enough to hear if you call, far enough to give privacy." I stood on the terrace as my children and their spouses emerged from their vehicles, looking rumpled and irritable after a night in the hotel, rather than the comfortable guest rooms they had expected. Their expressions registered surprise at seeing me so composed, so formally dressed at the breakfast table. "Good morning," I greeted them calmly. "I trust you slept well?" Michael adjusted his glasses nervously. "Mother, about yesterday?" I held up a hand. "Please, let's have breakfast first. Maria has prepared her wonderful tortilla española and the coffee is fresh. We can talk after we've eaten." This simple assertion of control, deciding when the conversation would happen, visibly unsettled them. They had expected tears, perhaps, or an emotional concession. Instead, they found me poised and unhurried, directing the flow of the morning as I had directed university departments and economic forums throughout my career. Breakfast progressed in awkward silence, punctuated only by stilted compliments about the food and weather. I observed them as they ate, my children and the partners they had chosen. How strange that I had known them their entire lives, yet somehow failed to see the entitlement that had grown unchecked within them. When the plates were cleared and fresh, coffee served, I folded my hands on the table and looked at each of them in turn. Yesterday, you presented me with what you consider a reasonable proposal for my future. Today, I will present you with my response. My voice remained even, conversational, almost. I have given your suggestions considerable thought. Rebecca leaned forward eagerly. So you understand we only want what's best? I understand what you want, I replied. But I've come to a different conclusion about what's best. For all of us. I took a sip of coffee, allowing the moment to stretch. Comfortably. This was a technique I had perfected in decades of university committee meetings, the power of the calm pause. I will not be selling my home. I will not be moving into a retirement facility. I will not be transferring my assets to your management. Those decisions are not open for discussion. David's face flushed. Mom, you're being stubborn. If you'd just look at the numbers, I have looked at the numbers, David. In fact, I've spent the morning reviewing my entire financial position with a banking specialist. Would you like to know what I discovered? Without waiting for a response, I continued. I discovered that I am in an exceptionally strong financial position. Strong enough that I don't need to sell my home or compromise my lifestyle in any way. Strong enough that I could support all three of you indefinitely if I chose to. Michael's eyebrows rose. Support us? That's not what, isn't it? I asked softly. David just acknowledged financial pressures at his firm. You mentioned funding cuts at the university. Rebecca's gallery is struggling. You came here not out of concern for my well-being, but because you see me, or more specifically my assets, as the solution to your problems. Sophia shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor, that's not entirely fair. Perhaps not entirely, I conceded. I believe you do care about me in your way. But care that comes with conditions isn't care at all. It's a transaction. And I am no longer interested in being the primary investor in relationships that offer such poor returns. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, whether from guilt or frustration I couldn't tell. Klaus stared fixedly at his coffee cup. David's jaw clenched in a way that reminded me painfully of Thomas. What are you saying? Michael finally asked. I'm saying that as of this morning, I have instructed my attorney to make significant changes to my estate planning and financial arrangements. The trust funds I established for each of you have been dissolved. The education funds for the grandchildren remain intact, but will now be controlled solely by me, with disbursements made directly to the educational institutions. My will has been revised to exclude all of you from inheriting this property or any significant portion of my estate. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the terrace tiles. You can't do that. We're your children. I can and I have, I replied, remaining seated. Being my children grants you my love, not entitlement to my possessions. This is about punishment, Rebecca said, voice trembling. You're punishing us for being honest about our concerns. I looked at her sadly. No, darling. This is about consequences. You came here with the premise that I am incapable of managing my own affairs. You presented me with a plan to strip me of my home, my independence, and my financial autonomy. Did you truly expect me to respond by giving you greater control over my life? Michael, ever the logical one, tried a different approach. Mother, you're overreacting. We can discuss this reasonably. We are discussing it reasonably, I interrupted. I am calmly explaining the consequences of your actions. There is nothing emotional or irrational about protecting myself from those who have demonstrated they do not have my best interests at heart. Klaus, who had remained largely silent throughout both conversations, finally spoke. What will happen? To the villa, then? If not to your children, where will it go? I allowed myself a small smile. I've established a foundation. Upon my death, which medical science suggests could be decades from now, this property will become a retreat center for women in academia, a place where female scholars can come to write, research, and collaborate without distraction. The Eleanor Whitmore Academic Retreat for Women. You're naming a building after yourself? David scoffed. I'm creating a legacy that reflects my values, I corrected. Something I had hoped to do through my children. Since that path has proven unreliable, I've found another. Sophia, who had seemed increasingly uncomfortable throughout the conversation, placed a restraining hand on Michael's arm as he began to protest again. Perhaps we should take some time to process this, she suggested. We're all saying things in the heat of the moment. An excellent suggestion, I agreed, standing to signal the end of the discussion. I think it would be best if you all return to your homes now. I have appointments this afternoon that cannot be rescheduled. You're asking us to leave? Rebecca looked stunned. I'm informing you that our discussion is concluded, and I have other commitments, I clarified. My attorney will be arriving shortly to finalize the changes we've discussed. You are welcome to return when you're prepared to relate to me as your mother, not as a financial resource to be managed. I watched their faces register shock, anger, hurt, a kaleidoscope of emotions that I received with calm detachment. This wasn't the outcome they had anticipated when they'd orchestrated their intervention. They had expected capitulation, not boundaries. As they gathered their belongings in stunned silence, I remained on the terrace, back straight, head high. When they filed past me toward their rental cars, I spoke one final time. I love you all. Very much, I said softly. That has never been in question. What has changed is my willingness to be diminished in the name of that love. When you're ready to see me, to truly see me, as a person worthy of respect rather than a problem to be solved, my door will be open. I didn't go down to the driveway to wave goodbye. Instead, I sat in the morning sunshine, listening to the engines start and fade as they drove away. Only when the last car had disappeared did I allow my shoulders to relax. Maria emerged from the kitchen, Carlos following respectfully, behind her. Señora, she said, her dark eyes assessing me carefully. You were magnificent, like a queen. I laughed softly. Not a queen, Maria, just a woman who finally remembered her own worth. Carlos stepped forward. The lawyer will need signed instructions. I've prepared some notes based on our discussion. I nodded, feeling lighter than I had in years. Thank you, Carlos. I believe this is the beginning of a very productive relationship. As they went back inside to prepare for Alejandro's arrival, I turned my face to the sun and took a deep breath. For the first time since they had arrived, I felt completely certain of my path forward. Sometimes dignity isn't about grand gestures or emotional outbursts. Sometimes it's simply the quiet refusal to be diminished, the calm assertion of one's own worth, and the courage to protect it, even from those you love most. Alejandro arrived, precisely at noon as promised, his silver Mercedes gliding to a stop in the circular driveway. He emerged with the purposeful efficiency that had made him one of Madrid's most sought-after attorneys, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, sunglasses shielding his eyes from the intense Spanish sun. At 68, Alejandro carried himself with the dignified grace of a man who had spent decades navigating the complexities of wealth, power, and family, often when all three collided. Eleanor, he greeted me with the traditional kiss on both cheeks as I met him at the front door. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in my composed appearance. You look remarkably well for someone who just went to war with her children. Advantage of age, Alejandro, I replied, leading him through the cool marble foyer into my study. You learn which battles leave scars and which simply leave clarity. Maria had prepared a light lunch of gazpacho, crusty bread, and a selection of Spanish cheeses, which waited for us alongside a pitcher of chilled water with lemon. Carlos sat at the far end of the antique desk that had once been Thomas's pride, his notes meticulously arranged before him. Carlos Delgado, I introduced him. Maria's nephew and a financial analyst at Banco de Malaga. He's been extremely helpful this morning. The men shook hands, exchanging the quick, subtle assessments professionals use to gauge one another. Whatever Alejandro saw in the younger man seemed to satisfy him. He nodded approvingly before turning his attention back to me. "Tell me everything," he said, setting his portfolio on the desk and extracting a leather-bound notebook. For the next hour, I recounted the events of the previous day and that morning, the arrival of my children, their thinly veiled agenda, and my response. Alejandro listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly watching my face with the attention of someone reading between lines of text. "So," he said when I had finished, "they attempted a coup, and you responded with a complete restructuring of your kingdom." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I've always admired your strategic thinking, Eleanor. Most clients call me after they've already surrendered the castle." "I haven't signed anything yet," I reminded him. "I need to know my options are legally sound." He turned to Carlos. "You've reviewed her financial position?" Carlos nodded, straightforward and professional. "Senora Whitmore's situation is exceptionally stable. Her investment portfolio is well diversified, her pension is substantial, and this property has appreciated significantly. Her current spending patterns are well within sustainable parameters. There is no financial justification whatsoever for the actions her children proposed." Alejandro made a satisfied sound low in his throat. "Then let's discuss how to protect all of it." He opened his portfolio and extracted several documents. "I've taken the liberty of drafting some preliminary papers based on our conversation this morning, but I suspect you have specific ideas about how you want to proceed." I leaned forward, hands clasped on the polished surface of Thomas's desk. "I do. I want to create a structure that accomplishes 3 things. First, it must secure my independence completely. Second, it must ensure that my legacy benefits causes I believe in, not children who see me as a resource to be harvested. And third," I paused, considering my words carefully, "it must leave open the possibility of reconciliation without vulnerability." Alejandro raised a questioning eyebrow at the third point. "They are still my children," I explained. "My heart hasn't changed, even if my trust has. I want to create boundaries, not burn bridges." He nodded, understanding softening his professional demeanor. "A complex assignment, but not impossible. Let's start with the foundation you mentioned, the Academic Retreat for Women." "The Eleanor Whitmore Academic Retreat for Women," I confirmed. "I've been considering something like this for years, ever since I realized how few women in my field had access to the kind of uninterrupted time and space that male academics take for granted. This property would be perfect. Private rooms for up to 8 scholars, common areas for collaboration, and that spectacular view to inspire great thinking." For the next several hours, we crafted the architecture of my new future. Alejandro drafted revisions to my will, established the foundation with an initial endowment, created an irrevocable trust to manage the villa, and restructured my investment accounts to protect them from any potential claims. Carlos provided valuable insights on tax implications and suggested several adjustments to my investment portfolio to maximize income while supporting the foundation's long-term sustainability. As the afternoon light began to soften into early evening, Alejandro reviewed the final arrangement with me one last time. "To summarize," he said, flipping through his notes, "your revised estate plan now includes the creation of the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, which will receive the villa and a substantial endowment upon your death, a revocable living trust that protects your assets during your lifetime while giving you complete control, education trusts for each grandchild that will make payments directly to educational institutions, a small but respectable inheritance for each of your children conditional upon certain behavioral requirements, and a separate trust to maintain your personal comfort and independence for the remainder of your life, including funds for travel, healthcare, and household staff." I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision pressing against my chest, not with anxiety but with a curious sense of freedom. "It's perfect, Alejandro. Everything I wanted." there's one more thing, he said, extracting a final document from his portfolio. A letter of intent regarding reconciliation parameters. I took the paper from him, scanning the carefully worded conditions. This is binding? No, he admitted. But it establishes clear expectations and can be referenced in future amendments to your estate plans. It creates a pathway for your children to restore their position as heirs, should they demonstrate the changes you wish to see. I read through the conditions again, each one reflecting a value I had tried, and apparently failed, to instill in my children. Respect for autonomy, financial responsibility, genuine care without expectation of reward. Simple human decencies that had somehow become negotiable in their minds. This is exactly right, I said, emotion finally catching in my throat. Thank you. As Alejandro gathered the documents requiring my signature, Carlos excused himself to give us privacy. I appreciated his sensitivity. This moment felt intensely personal, like signing the final papers after Thomas's death. An ending and a beginning, marked by the stroke of a pen. One by one, I signed the documents, each signature a declaration of independence. With each completed page, I felt myself reclaiming something that had been slowly eroding without my notice. My sovereignty, my self-determination, my right to define the terms of my own life. When the last signature was dry, Alejandro collected the papers and secured them in his portfolio. I'll file everything first thing tomorrow morning. By noon, your new arrangements will be legally binding. And my children? I asked. Will they be notified? Only of the changes that directly affect them, the dissolution of their trust funds primarily. The rest remains private unless you choose to disclose it. He paused, studying me with the gentle concern of an old friend rather than a legal advisor. Are you certain about this, Eleanor? It's a significant change. I moved to the window, looking out over the garden where shadows had begun to lengthen across the lawn. In the distance, the Mediterranean glowed with the golden light of approaching sunset, the same view that had sustained me through widowhood, through empty nesting, through rebuilding a life I hadn't planned for, but had come to cherish. I'm certain, I said finally. Not because I love them less, but because I've finally understood that allowing yourself to be diminished doesn't benefit the ones who diminish you. It only teaches them that your boundaries are optional, your dignity, negotiable. Alejandro joined me at the window, his reflection appearing beside mine in the glass. For what it's worth, I think Thomas would be proud of you today. Would he? I asked softly. I keep wondering what he would have done. He wouldn't have needed to do anything, Alejandro replied. The children never would have attempted this if he were alive. Men are allowed their authority without question. Women, even brilliant, accomplished women like yourself, must constantly defend theirs, especially from their own children. The simple truth of his observation settled over me. How often had I deferred to my children's preferences, accommodated their schedules, adjusted my plans to fit theirs, not from love alone, but from some unspoken sense that my needs were somehow less legitimate, my time less valuable? How often had I interpreted their demands as normal, my boundaries as selfish? I won't be doing that anymore, I said, more to myself than to Alejandro. Good, he replied simply. It's about time. After Alejandro left, promising to return with the finalized documents later in the week, I found myself alone in the villa for the first time since my children's arrival. The silence felt different now, not the peaceful solitude I had cultivated over years, but something more definitive, like the clean break between before and after. I poured myself a glass of wine and carried it out to the garden, settling into the wrought iron chair beneath the ancient olive tree that had stood sentinel over the property for centuries before I arrived and would remain long after I was gone. The evening air was perfumed with jasmine and sea salt, a combination I had come to associate with home more than any house I had lived in before. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message from Victoria. Flight arrives 14:30 tomorrow. Bringing champagne, chocolate, and a suitcase full of righteous indignation on your behalf. Save your energy for plotting our spectacular third acts. I smiled, feeling the first genuine lightness since this ordeal began. Victoria had been my closest friend since our first day at university, when we'd bonded over being the only two women in our economics seminar. She had stood beside me through Thomas's death, through my children's various crises, through the challenges of building a career in a field that barely tolerated women. Of course, she would be here for this transition, too. My phone buzzed again. Michael this time. "Mother, we need to talk about this. You're making rash decisions that affect all of us. Please call when you're thinking more clearly." I set the phone down without responding. There would be time for conversations later, after the legal protections were firmly in place, after I had gathered my strength and my allies around me. For now, I needed this moment of certainty, this clear boundary between who I had been, a mother defined primarily by her service to others, and who I was becoming, a woman standing firmly in her own authority. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I made my final decision of the day. I would not spend my remaining years defending my right to exist on my own terms. I would not shrink myself to accommodate others' expectations. I would not apologize for taking up space in the world, for having needs, for prioritizing my own joy. This moment, this quiet evening in my garden, with the Mediterranean stretching before me and the scent of flowers in the air, this belonged to me. And so did all the moments that would follow, for however many years remained to me. In the failing light, I raised my glass in a solitary toast. "To you, Thomas," I whispered, "to the gathering darkness, and to me, to choices made and paths taken, to whatever comes next." Tomorrow, Victoria would arrive. We would drink champagne on the terrace and begin planning adventures we had postponed for decades. We would laugh and remember who we had been before husbands and children and careers had shaped our lives into predictable patterns. We would reimagine ourselves not as diminished by age, but as liberated by it, free at last to pursue joy without justification. Tonight, though, I needed only this: the quiet certainty that I had finally chosen myself, not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. The knowledge that whatever storms might come, and they would come, I had no illusions about that. I had built a foundation strong enough to weather them. As darkness settled completely over the garden, I remained beneath the olive tree, thinking, not of what I had lost, but of what I had reclaimed. Not an ending, after all, but a beginning. Not a closing door, but an opening horizon. The critical decision had been made. Now came the freedom of moving forward. Victoria arrived exactly as promised, sweeping through the airport arrival gates, trailing a matched set of burgundy leather luggage behind her. At 67, she remained as striking as she had been in our university days. Silver hair cut in a sharp bob that framed a face lined by laughter rather than worry, bright blue eyes that missed nothing, and the confident posture of a woman who had never apologized for taking up space in the world. "Darling," she exclaimed, abandoning her luggage to embrace me tightly. "You look far too composed for someone whose children just tried to commit financial matricide." I laughed despite myself. This was Victoria's gift, the ability to name the absurd and make it manageable. "I'm saving my breakdown for after the champagne," I replied, linking my arm through hers. "Excellent planning as always," she approved, as we collected her bags and headed toward the parking area. "Now, tell me everything. Spare no detail, and don't you dare minimize what they did." The drive from Malaga Airport to the villa took just under an hour, time that Victoria filled with alternating expressions of outrage on my behalf and shrewd questions about my financial arrangements. By the time we turned onto the cypress-lined drive leading to my home, She had a comprehensive understanding of both the emotional and practical dimensions of my situation. "So the foundation is already established," she confirmed as we pulled up to the house. "The paperwork was filed yesterday," I nodded. Alejandro moved with remarkable efficiency. The Eleanor Whitmore Academic Retreat for Women now exists as a legal entity with the villa and a substantial endowment set to transfer upon my death. Victoria surveyed the property with new eyes as we exited the car. "It's perfect for it, you know. All those separate bedroom suites, the library, the views. I can just see brilliant women writing groundbreaking papers on that terrace. That's the idea," I smiled, leading her inside. "But that's decades away, I hope. For now, I have other plans." Maria had prepared the guest suite overlooking the Eastern Gardens, Victoria's favorite from previous visits. Fresh flowers from the garden brightened the bedside table, and French doors opened onto a private balcony with views of both the mountains and a glimpse of the sea beyond. "Heaven," Victoria sighed, dropping onto the plush armchair by the window. "Now, you mentioned other plans just now. Care to elaborate?" I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly feeling the emotional weight of the past few days. "I'm not entirely sure yet. I know I want to travel. There are so many places Thomas and I plan to see together that I never got around to visiting. I know I want to finish my memoir, and I know I don't want to spend another moment feeling guilty for prioritizing my own joy." "An excellent start," Victoria approved. "But might I suggest something a bit more immediate? Something that signals to both you and your wayward offspring that a new era has begun?" "I'm listening," I said, curious. "A transformation," she said with dramatic flair. "Not just of legal documents and financial arrangements, but of your environment. This villa has been your haven, but it also holds decades of memories of you, as mother and grandmother, hostess and caretaker. Perhaps it's time the space reflected the woman you're becoming rather than the role you've played." I considered her words carefully. The villa had indeed remained largely unchanged since Thomas's death. I had preserved his study exactly as he left it, maintained the children's rooms like museum exhibits of their younger selves, and arranged common spaces to accommodate family gatherings that occurred with decreasing frequency. "You're suggesting a renovation?" I asked. "I'm suggesting liberation," Victoria corrected. "A conscious reclaiming of your space. Thomas's study becomes your writing room. The children's old bedrooms transform into whatever serves your current passions, a painting studio, perhaps, or a music room. The formal dining room where you've hosted family holidays becomes, I don't know, a ballroom where we can dance. In our pajamas at midnight if we choose." The mental image made me laugh. Two women in their 60s, dancing without constraint in a room that had previously been reserved for proper family occasions. There was something deliciously subversive about the idea. "I like it," I said, feeling a spark of excitement for the first time in days. "A physical manifestation of the internal changes." "Exactly," Victoria beamed. "Now shall we have that champagne while we plot the revolution?" The next morning, after a night of long conversation, and perhaps a bit too much champagne, we began in earnest. Armed with notepads, measuring tape, and Maria's enthusiastic support, we moved through the villa room by room, reimagining each space. Thomas's study, a handsome room lined with dark wood bookshelves and dominated by a massive mahogany desk, was our first target. I had preserved it as a shrine of sorts, maintaining his collection of first-edition economics texts, the fountain pens he favored, even the half-finished manuscripts he had been working on before his heart attack. "When was the last time you actually used this room?" Victoria asked gently as we stood in the doorway. "I dust it every week," I replied, avoiding the question. "That's not what I asked, Ellie." I sighed. "I haven't. Not really. It felt presumptuous somehow." Victoria squeezed my hand. "He would hate that, you know. Thomas never wanted to be preserved in amber. He wanted you to live." "I know," I admitted. "It's just been easier to keep things as they were. Easier, perhaps, but not better." Victoria stepped into the room decisively, moving toward the heavy curtains that had remained drawn for years. With a dramatic flourish, she pulled them open, allowing Spanish sunlight to flood the space. Dust motes danced in the sudden brightness, and the view of the Mediterranean, one of the best in the house, was suddenly revealed. "Oh," I breathed, seeing the room as if for the first time. I'd forgotten how beautiful the light is in here. "This," Victoria declared, gesturing to the view, "is where you'll write your memoir. Not tucked away in that little corner of the bedroom where you've been working, but here, with the sea and sky before you." Something shifted in my chest. A loosening of grief so gradual I hadn't realized how tightly it still held me. "Yes," I agreed. "This is where I'll write." We spent the morning emptying the bookshelves, sorting Thomas's collections, some to be donated to his former university, some to be kept but relocated to other parts of the house. By lunchtime, the room was half transformed, the heavy curtains replaced with light linen ones that diffused the sunlight, the imposing desk repositioned to face the view rather than the door. After a light lunch on the terrace, we tackled the children's rooms. Michael's had remained largely unchanged since his university days. Academic trophies still lined the shelves, physics textbooks stacked neatly on the desk, a periodic table poster still tacked to the wall despite the fact that he now had a PhD and taught at Cambridge. "What would you like this room to become?" Victoria asked as we surveyed the space. I considered the question seriously. The room had excellent natural light from east-facing windows, and enough space for whatever purpose I might imagine. "I've always wanted to try painting," I said finally. "Not because I have any particular talent, but for the pure pleasure of color and form." "An art studio," Victoria declared. "Perfect." Rebecca's room came next, a feminine space with floral wallpaper she had chosen as a teenager and never updated. This we reimagined as a music room, a place where I could return to the piano I had abandoned when the demands of motherhood and career had squeezed out time for personal pursuits. David's room, the smallest but with the coziest alcove, would become a reading nook, with comfortable seating and shelves for the fiction I had always loved but rarely prioritized. By late afternoon, Maria's nephew Carlos had returned with several colleagues from the village, strong young men eager for the extra work, to help move furniture and begin the physical transformation. The energy in the house shifted palpably as spaces were cleared. Walls exposed, possibilities opened. "Señora," Maria said, finding me alone in what had been Thomas's study, now nearly emptied of his presence. "Are you certain about all this change? It is happening very quickly." I looked around the room, at the marks on the wall where bookshelves had stood for decades, at the outline of slightly darker wood on the floor where his desk had previously been positioned. There was a poignant emptiness to the space now, a sense of something ending, but also beginning. "I'm certain," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "It's long overdue." Maria nodded, her dark eyes warm with understanding. "Your children have been calling the house phone," she said. "Many times today. They sound upset." "I imagine they are," I replied. "I'll speak with them when I'm ready." "And the workmen? They ask about tomorrow. There is much more to do." "Tell them to continue," I said. "All of it. Everything we discussed." That evening, as Victoria and I shared a simple dinner on the terrace, my phone buzzed repeatedly with texts and calls from my children. Each notification felt like a small dart against my newfound resolve. Finally, Victoria reached over and silenced my phone, sliding it face down on the table. "They can wait," she said firmly. "You've waited for years, for their visits, their calls, their attention. They can grant you the same courtesy now." "They're worried," I said, feeling the familiar pull of maternal concern. "They're worried about their inheritance," Victoria corrected. "There's a difference." "Not entirely," I protested. "They do love me in their way." Victoria's expression softened. I know they do, darling. But love without respect isn't enough. You've spent decades accommodating their needs, adjusting to their preferences, making yourself smaller to avoid inconveniencing them. It's time they learned to accommodate you for a change. I knew she was right, but decades of maternal instinct were difficult to override. I'll call them tomorrow, I compromised, after we finish with the main floor renovations. Fair enough, Victoria agreed. But remember, you're setting the tone for your relationship moving forward. Every time you drop everything to address their concerns, you reinforce the old pattern. The next morning, construction began in earnest. The formal dining room that had hosted decades of family holidays was emptied, its heavy furniture temporarily moved to storage. The formal living room, rarely used but maintained for appearances, was next, its precious antiques and delicate ornaments carefully packed away. What exactly are we creating here? I asked Victoria as we stood in the center of the now empty dining room, our voices echoing slightly in the barren space. Possibility, she replied simply. These rooms have served a function that no longer exists, hosting family gatherings that happen rarely, if at all. Now they can become whatever you need in this new chapter. By mid-afternoon, the transformation had reached a critical point. Walls exposed, furniture removed, the villa stripped back to its bones in a way that felt both vulnerable and exhilarating. Standing amid the construction debris, dust in my hair and paint samples in my hands, I felt a curious lightness. The physical act of reimagining my space had begun to reshape my internal landscape as well. Senora? Maria called from the entrance, her expression concerned. Your son Michael is here. He says he must speak with you immediately. Victoria and I exchanged glances. The confrontation had arrived sooner than expected. Where is he? I asked, brushing dust from my clothes. In the garden, Maria replied. He seems very upset about the changes. I took a deep breath, centering myself. Tell him I'll join him shortly. Victoria squeezed my arm. Remember who you are now, she said softly. Not who they expect you to be. As I stepped into the garden to face my son, I carried those words with me, a talisman against the gravitational pull of old patterns, old expectations. The initial steps had been taken. There was no going back now, only forward into this new, self-determined life. I found Michael pacing near the olive tree, his academic composure notably absent. When he saw me approaching, he stopped abruptly, his expression a mixture of confusion and indignation. Mother, what on earth is going on? He gestured wildly toward the villa. There are workers everywhere, furniture being carried out, walls being... What is happening to the house? I settled calmly into the wrought iron chair beneath the olive tree, my favorite spot for contemplation. I'm renovating, Michael, updating. Spaces that no longer serve their original purpose. But my old room? His voice held a note of disbelief. They're removing everything. The bookshelves, the desk where I studied for my A-levels, all of it. And Father's study. How could you dismantle that? It's as if you're erasing us. I studied my son's face, the tight lines around his mouth, the furrow between his brows that reminded me so much of Thomas. In his eyes, I could see genuine distress, not just concern for material possessions or inheritance. I'm not erasing anyone, Michael, I said gently. I'm making room for myself. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he'd had since childhood when confronted with something he couldn't immediately categorize or control. But why now? Why like this, without discussing it with any of us? When was the last time you consulted me before making changes to your home? I asked, keeping my tone conversational rather than accusatory. That's different, he dismissed. Instantly. Is it? I raised an eyebrow. 3 days ago, You and your siblings arrived with a fully formed plan to remove me from my home and redistribute my assets without any prior consultation. Why should redecorating my own house require more discussion than decisions about my entire future? Michael had the grace to look uncomfortable. He sat heavily on the stone bench opposite me, shoulders slumping slightly. We made a mistake, he admitted, eyes fixed on the ground between us. The retirement facility? It was an overreaction. But cutting us off completely, changing your will, dissolving the trusts? Isn't that an overreaction too? It's not a punishment, Michael. It's a boundary. It feels like punishment, he muttered. I leaned forward, waiting until he met my gaze. I understand it feels that way. But consider my perspective for a moment. You three came here not out of concern for my well-being, but because you saw my assets as the solution to your financial problems. You were willing to significantly diminish my quality of life to elevate yours. That revealed something profound about our relationship, something that required correction. He started to protest, but I held up a hand. Let me finish. I've spent years, decades, prioritizing all of you, supporting your education, your career choices, your families. I've maintained rooms you rarely use, preserved traditions you seldom participate in, and made myself available whenever you needed financial or emotional support. And in return, when you thought I might need something, your first instinct wasn't to offer help. It was to take control. Michael sat silently, absorbing my words. That's not a healthy dynamic, I continued. Not for you, and certainly not for me. So yes, I'm making significant changes to my home, to my finances, and to our relationship. Not to punish you, but to establish what should have been clear all along. I am a person in my own right, not just your mother, not just the keeper of your childhood home, and not just a financial resource to be tapped when needed. For several long moments, we sat in silence, the only sounds the distant echo of construction inside the villa and the gentle rustle of olive leaves above us. I watched emotions play across Michael's face, defensiveness, confusion, and finally, a reluctant glimmer of understanding. You said it's a boundary, not a punishment, he said finally. What does that mean exactly? Where do we go from here? That depends largely on you, I replied honestly. I've established the foundation, restructured my finances, and begun reclaiming my space. Those changes aren't negotiable, but our relationship, that can evolve if you're willing to relate to me differently. Differently how? As a whole person, not just a role. Someone with dreams and desires of her own. Someone worthy of consultation rather than management. Someone whose generosity should be appreciated rather than expected. Michael sighed deeply, looking up at the villa, the home that had been his anchor throughout childhood and university, the place he had always assumed would remain unchanged regardless of how his own life evolved. And if we can't accept these changes, he asked quietly, then I'll miss you terribly, I said, feeling a lump form in my throat. But I won't compromise my dignity to keep you in my life. I love you enough to set that boundary, even knowing I might lose you in the process. Something in his expression shifted, a subtle recognition perhaps of the strength it had taken to make this stand. I need time to process all this, he said, and to talk to Rebecca and David. Take all the time you need, I replied. I'm not going anywhere. The seasons in southern Spain transition gradually, summer melting into autumn with subtle shifts of light rather than dramatic changes in weather. 3 months passed after my confrontation with Michael, months of transformation both within the villa and within myself. The renovations proceeded with remarkable efficiency under Victoria's enthusiastic direction and Maria's practical oversight. By the end of the first month, Thomas's study had become my writing room, flooded with Mediterranean light and arranged to inspire creativity rather than preserve the past. The children's old bedrooms had transformed into spaces for art, music, and reading. each one reflecting a passion I had set aside for too long. The formal dining room, once dominated by a massive table that had hosted decades of family holidays, now housed comfortable seating arranged in conversation groups, bookshelves lined with volumes I'd always wanted to read, and a small bar cart stocked with excellent spirits. A salon, Victoria had declared, for intellectual stimulation and spirited debate. As the physical spaces within the villa transformed, so too did my daily rhythms. Mornings found me writing at the desk overlooking the sea, working steadily on the memoir I had postponed for years. Afternoons were devoted to exploration, painting classes in the village, piano practice on the baby grand I had installed in the music room, long walks along the coastal paths I had previously been too busy to enjoy. Victoria remained for 6 weeks, her presence a catalyst for both physical renovations and internal revelations. When she finally returned to Portugal, it was with a promise to visit monthly and plans for us to travel to Greece in the spring, a trip we had talked about since university but never prioritized. Throughout those months, my children maintained a careful distance. Occasional text messages arrived, perfunctory birthday wishes for the grandchildren, brief updates about work, but no substantive communication, no acknowledgement of our last conversation, no indication of whether they were moving toward acceptance or further entrenching in resentment. I maintained my boundary with what surprised me as relative ease. There were moments of sadness, of course, particularly when milestones passed uncelebrated together. But those moments no longer overwhelmed me with guilt or obligation. Instead, they served as gentle reminders of why these changes had been necessary in the first place. Then, one crisp October morning, as I sat writing on the terrace, Maria appeared with an unusual announcement. "Señora, all 3 of your children are here, together. They ask to speak with you." I set down my pen, brushing away the momentary flutter of anxiety. "Where are they?" "In the garden, near the olive tree. They said they would wait until you were ready." I thanked her and took a moment to collect myself before heading toward the garden. The renovation had transformed the villa inside and out. New landscaping had opened views previously obscured by overgrown hedges, and comfortable seating areas now dotted the property, inviting lingering rather than merely passing through. My 3 children stood awkwardly beneath the olive tree, a strange mirror of the scene 3 months earlier with Michael. They looked different somehow. Less polished, perhaps, or simply less certain of their position. David had lost weight, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. Rebecca's typically perfect makeup was minimal, her expression unguarded. Michael stood slightly apart, hands clasped behind his back in the professorial stance he had adopted in adulthood. "This is a surprise," I said, approaching them with deliberate calm. "All 3 of you, without warning." David stepped forward first. "We didn't want to give you the chance to prepare a defense," he said, then winced at his own phrasing. "I mean, we wanted this to be honest, raw even." "All right," I nodded, gesturing to the new seating area beneath the tree. "Let's be honest then. We arranged ourselves in a circle, the 4 of us facing each other without the barriers of dining tables or formal furniture, without the protective shields of roles and expectations. For a moment, no one spoke. "The house looks different," Rebecca finally offered, glancing toward the villa. "It's lighter somehow." "It feels different too," I replied, "more authentic to who I am now." Another silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tensions. "We owe you an apology," Michael said eventually, his academic precision giving weight to each word. "What we did, coming here with demands rather than concerns, treating you as a problem to solve rather than a person to respect, it was unconscionable." "It was worse than that," David added, his financier's composure cracking slightly. "It was cruel. And selfish. I've spent 3 months trying to justify our actions even to myself, and I can't. We were wrong." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. We were so focused on our own problems that we couldn't see. You, the woman who raised us, who sacrificed for us, who always put us first. We repaid decades of love with calculation and condescension. Their words washed over me. The apology I had not allowed myself to hope for. The recognition I had not expected to receive. I felt something tight within my chest begin to loosen, a knot of hurt I had carried for months finally starting to unravel. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a great deal to me." David leaned forward, his expression earnest. "We've been doing a lot of thinking, Mom, about patterns, about expectations, about the ways we've taken your support for granted. We've also been talking to each other," Michael added. "Really talking, not just coordinating holiday visits or discussing investments. About our childhoods, about Dad's death, about how we've related to you since then. And we realized something," Rebecca continued. "We've been treating you as an extension of ourselves, a resource, a safety net, a keeper of our past, rather than as a woman with her own identity and future. It took losing our inheritance to make us see that we were also losing you." I studied their faces, searching for signs of manipulation or calculation. Instead, I found only genuine remorse and what appeared to be sincere self-reflection. "What changed?" I asked. "Besides the financial consequences, I mean." They exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Lily," Rebecca said finally. "My daughter. She found out what we had done. Apparently Klaus let it slip during an argument. She was devastated, disgusted actually. She refused to speak to me for weeks, saying she couldn't believe her mother would treat her grandmother that way." "Emma and Ethan reacted similarly," Michael admitted. "They've always adored you. When they learned what we had proposed, well, let's just say they provided a perspective we hadn't considered." "I didn't have children to disappoint," David added with a wry smile. "But I did have a moment of clarity while clearing out my flat, downsizing to something I could actually afford without your help. I found those economics books you gave me when I started university, the ones with your notes in the margins. It hit me then. You've never been just our mother. You've been a brilliant economist, a respected professor, a woman who rebuilt her life after losing her husband. And we reduced you to a problem that needed solving." Their words resonated with a truth I had felt but struggled to articulate. For too long, I had allowed myself to be defined solely by my relationship to them, had measured my worth by their approval and my usefulness by their needs. "What happens now?" I asked, not willing to abandon my boundaries despite the unexpected. "Apology. That's entirely up to you," Michael replied. "We've come with no expectations, no demands, no agenda. Just the hope that we might find a way forward, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation or entitlement. And if that's not possible," Rebecca added, "we'll understand. We've earned your distrust." I considered their words, carefully, weighing the sincerity of their apology against the depth of the betrayal that had preceded it. 3 months earlier, I would have embraced forgiveness instantly, prioritizing reconciliation over my own well-being. Now, I recognize the importance of proceeding with caution. "I appreciate your coming here today," I said finally. "And I accept your apology. But rebuilding trust will take time. I'm not willing to return to our previous dynamic, not for your sake and certainly not for mine." "We don't want that either," David assured me quickly. "We've seen what you've created here, how you've reclaimed your life. We wouldn't want to diminish that, even if we could." "Then perhaps we can begin again," I suggested. "Not as mother and children with all the baggage that entails, but as adults who share a history and might yet build a future, on different terms than before." "We'd like that," Michael nodded, a cautious hope lighting his eyes. I looked at each of them in turn. These adults who had emerged from the children I had raised, these individuals navigating their own complex lives with varying degrees of success and struggle. I loved them still, of course. That had never been in question. But now that love came with conditions: respect for my autonomy, recognition of my worth beyond what I could provide, acceptance of my right to prioritize my own joy. "There's a new restaurant in the village," I said, making my decision. "Perhaps we could have dinner there tonight. Neutral territory, as it were. A first step." The relief on their faces was palpable, though tempered with the understanding that this was the beginning of a journey, not the end. "We'd like that very much," Rebecca smiled, tears still glimmering in her eyes. As we rose to walk back toward the villa, David hesitated, then asked the question I suspected had been on all their minds. "Mom, what about the inheritance? The foundation? Is there any way to— we understand now, but—" I held up a hand to stop him. "Let's be very clear about one thing. My financial decisions are not negotiable as a condition of reconciliation. The foundation remains, the structure of my estate remains. Your conditional inheritances remain conditional." He nodded, accepting this boundary with surprising grace. "That's fair. More than fair, actually. That said," I continued, "there are other ways I might support you, if needed. Not financially, but with guidance, connections, the wisdom I've accumulated over 40 years in economics. If you're open to that kind of support—" "I'd welcome it," he admitted. "All of it. Turns out I'm not nearly as clever with investments as I thought." For the first time in months, I felt a genuine laugh bubble up within me. None of us are, darling. That's why diversification exists. As we walked back toward the villa, the Mediterranean sun warm on our shoulders, I felt a curious sense of completion. Not because our relationship had been fully restored, but because it had been fundamentally redefined. The ground beneath us was newer, less familiar, but ultimately more stable than the shifting sands of expectation and obligation we had built upon before. The quiet hum of conversation drifted up from the terrace below, where my children sat with Victoria, glasses of wine in hand as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Their visit, originally planned for one evening, had extended to 3 days, days filled with careful conversations, tentative connections, and gradual rebuilding of trust. I stood at the railing of my private balcony, observing them without participating, giving myself the space to process this unexpected turn of events. Victoria caught my eye and raised her glass slightly, a silent gesture of support and approval. In the 3 months since our confrontation, much had changed beyond the physical transformation of the villa. I had traveled to Portugal to visit Victoria, had enrolled in a master gardening course at the local university, and had completed nearly half of my memoir. I had formed new friendships with neighbors I'd barely known before, joined a weekly painting group in the village, and even, to my own surprise, enjoyed a brief flirtation with a visiting professor from Barcelona who had attended one of my economic lectures at the university. In short, I had begun to live fully, not as mother, widow, or professor emeritus, but simply as Eleanor, a woman with passions, opinions, and desires of her own. My children's return hadn't disrupted this newfound equilibrium as I had feared it might. Instead, they had entered this transformed space as visitors rather than stakeholders, observers of my life rather than arbiters of it. There had been moments of awkwardness, certainly, as we navigated this unfamiliar terrain. Old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, Rebecca automatically clearing dishes as if she were still a helpful daughter in her mother's home, Michael instinctively questioning my travel plans as if they required his approval, David reflexively offering financial advice I hadn't requested. Each time, I had gently redirected, establishing boundaries with kindness but firmness. "I have a system for the dishes, darling. My trip to Greece is already planned, thank you." My investments are quite well managed, though I appreciate your concern. Small moments, seemingly insignificant, yet each one reinforcing the fundamental change in our relationship. I was no longer seeking their approval, accommodating their preferences, or adjusting my life to fit their expectations. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the terrace, I made my way downstairs to join them. Victoria made room for me in the comfortable chair beside her, pouring a glass of wine from the bottle they had been sharing. "We were just discussing Christmas," she informed me. "Your children seem to think you'll be hosting as usual. I've been explaining your plans to visit the Christmas markets in Vienna with me." I smiled at the directness of her approach. Victoria had never believed in softening truths to spare feelings. "Actually," I said, taking a sip of wine, "I was thinking we might try something different this year. I won't be hosting here. That tradition has run its course, I think. But I would be open to joining you all somewhere new. Perhaps renting a chalet in Switzerland, where none of us would be the host and all of us would be guests." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment, a proposal rather than an obligation, an invitation rather than an expectation. "I'd like that," Rebecca said finally. "A fresh start in a neutral space." "The twins would love the snow," Michael added. "And I could actually relax instead of working through the holidays for once," David mused. Victoria caught my eye, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This was the test I had been building toward. Not whether we could reconcile, but whether that reconciliation could occur on terms that honored rather than diminished me. Later that night, after my children had retired to their rooms, guest rooms now, redecorated without reference to their childhood preferences, Victoria and I sat alone on the terrace, sharing the last of the wine. "They're trying," she observed. "I didn't expect that, to be honest." "Neither did I admitted. I was prepared for anger, manipulation, even permanent estrangement. Not growth. "You underestimate the power of your example," Victoria said, gesturing toward the transformed villa around us. "You showed them that fulfillment comes from honoring yourself, not from clinging to others or what they can provide. That's a powerful lesson from a mother to her children at any age." I considered her words, watching the starlight reflect on the dark surface of the sea below. I keep waiting for the guilt to return, the feeling that I should have accommodated them, that I should have continued in the role they expected. "And has it?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "No, that's the most remarkable thing. When I drew the boundary, something shifted permanently. I can't go back to who I was before, even if I wanted to." "Would you want to?" Victoria challenged gently. "Not for a moment," I replied without hesitation. "I've discovered something I never expected to find at 65. Freedom. Not just from their expectations, but from my own. The freedom to want what I want without justification, to take up space without apology, to prioritize joy without guilt." Victoria raised her glass in a silent toast, and we sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs below. 3 months earlier, my children had gathered in my living room and told me I had become a burden, financially and emotionally draining, an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be respected. In that moment, something fundamental had broken between us. Not just trust, but the tacit agreement that had governed our relationship for decades. That my needs would always be secondary to theirs. Now, as they slept under my roof once more, as guests rather than entitled offspring, I realized that the breaking had been necessary for true rebuilding to occur. Not just of our relationship, but of my relationship with myself. At 65, I had finally learned that the most profound act of love, for oneself and for others, is sometimes the quiet, dignified refusal to be diminished. The courage to stand firmly in one's worth, even when those closest to you fail to recognize it. The wisdom to know that genuine connection can only exist between people who see and respect each other fully. My villa stood transformed on the Spanish cliffs, its rooms filled with light and possibility, its spaces reflecting the woman I had become rather than the roles I had played. And I stood transformed as well, no longer defined by what I gave to others, but by what I had reclaimed for myself. Not a burden, but a woman of substance. Not diminished by age, but enhanced by it. Not at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of the most authentic chapter yet. This was my legacy, not the wealth my children had coveted or the property they had hoped to claim, but the example of a life reclaimed, reimagined, and lived without apology. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.